Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Gerton. I'm president of the National Academy of Public Administration, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel session highlighting the Academy's latest report. Developing a professional cybersecurity workforce is critical to an effective national response to cybersecurity challenges, which in turn is a responsibility of the federal government. And yet estimates of the significant and increasing national cybersecurity workforce gap range in the hundreds of thousands across the United States and in the millions worldwide. And the federal government lacks a comprehensive, integrated government-wide strategy for developing a national cybersecurity workforce. As part of the FY21 Consolidated Appropriations Act, Congress appropriated funding for a review of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA's program, to build a national cybersecurity workforce. CISA contracted with the Academy to assess whether the partnership models that they were developing are likely to be effective and scalable to address national needs for a highly capable cybersecurity workforce, to examine partnership models used by other agencies in the private sector, and to assess whether CISA's strategy has made progress on the national cybersecurity workforce development objectives, including excellence, scale, and diversity. The Academy appointed a panel of 5 expert fellows to oversee and guide this study. And that panel determined that an effective assessment of CISA's cybersecurity workforce strategy and programs would entail looking more broadly at the federal government's efforts to help develop the nation's cybersecurity workforce. This study was informed through documentary research and interviews with experts at CISA, the Office of the National Cybersecurity Director, and other federal agencies, and experts in state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. The panel also met with representatives from industry, higher education, and other entities. The final report was released publicly yesterday, and we're pleased to be here today with a most knowledgeable panel to discuss the report's recommendations and next steps for implementation. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. Dan Chenok, an Academy Fellow and co-chair of the Academy Study Panel, is the Executive Director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government and former Chief of the Information Policy and Technology Branch at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. Karen Evans, also an Academy Fellow and co-chair of the Academy Study Panel, is the Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute and the former Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Kiersten Todt is the Chief of Staff at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and John Costello is the Chief of Staff for the Office of the National Cybersecurity Director. Thank you all for joining us today. And Dan, you get the opening question. The first panel finding in the report is that the government lacks a comprehensive, integrated government-wide strategy for developing the national cybersecurity workforce. Tell us a bit more about the panel's recommendation to create that strategy and how the panel filled in some of the gaps.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for the opportunity to join you and to join such an outstanding panel discussion around the Academy's report, and for the opportunity to help lead the work of the panel as a whole and the fantastic study team that you assembled. The recommendation that we had around strategy is essentially to provide a North Star for all of the different efforts that are ongoing in the government now, and to really build on those efforts, many of which were foundational to the development of a strategy across the government. A number of efforts cited in the report include the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, National Cybersecurity Education Initiative, the NICE, and the work that they've done, the work that other agencies have done, informed the panel to suggest that we integrate those strategic efforts into a recommended strategy across the government that builds on these foundational efforts. And that strategy includes a number of elements that again, advance the work of the agencies and would help assist the National Cybersecurity Director, CISA, and other agencies involved in cybersecurity education to work with their partners in industry and academia to really drive a whole of government effort that can help the nation address these cybersecurity challenges. And there were 4 elements that the panel recommended. The first was to encourage more people to enter careers in cybersecurity education, to work with K-12 institutions, institutions of higher education to identify this as a real opportunity to create a career path for cybersecurity workforce in a similar manner to other professions. As kids go through school, they can think about this the same way they might think about medicine or law. The second was to really enable the education and training institutes, especially at the advanced education level in terms of technical training, higher education, community colleges, to provide the types of skills that can enable competencies for people moving into cybersecurity education to see, here are the basic competencies we need at a technical level, at a managerial level, at an operational level to enter the profession. And then here are the ways that we can establish a career path across those competencies as they advance in their career. The third recommendation was around sort of what stands in the way of that being able to take place. And these are around what are the barriers to recruiting talent? Are there issues around federal hiring processes that are preventing rapid acceleration of adoption of cybersecurity talent and integration of government and industry in providing cybersecurity solutions? And are there pathways that can match people with skills to the jobs that are necessary to provide for cybersecurity education? And these are broader than those jobs that exist in a CIO's office, Chief Information Officer, or a Chief Information Security Officer, because cybersecurity really matters across all of the programs that the government is involved in, all of the companies that are involved in protecting our nation's critical infrastructure, and really all of us in how we operate our lives. And including cybersecurity skills, whether it's a cybersecurity professional as a full-time job or whether it's people that understand the importance of cybersecurity, is something that's really important in terms of matching those skills to jobs where cybersecurity matters. And then finally, the panel recommended that the strategy include assessment of performance of cybersecurity programs across the government to see how those programs can work together, can be integrated, can really raise the bar for all of the great work that's going on now, and provide benchmarks so that the public can understand what the government is doing to improve and innovate in the cybersecurity workforce area. So that was sort of the picture of the strategy the panel recommended.
So it sounds easy to say, but probably not so easy to do. John, let me turn to you because the Office of the National Cybersecurity Director is a new White House organization. How are you thinking about coordinating with CISA and the many players across the federal cyber workforce landscape so that government efforts are aligned and can achieve positive outcomes?
Excellent. So first of all, let me thank you and thank NAPA for inviting us, and also soliciting our opinion and our input in developing your report and your recommendations. Let me first state unequivocally that ensuring a healthy, sustainable national cyber workforce, and that includes the workforce in our federal departments and agencies, is a top priority of the National Cyber Director. It is now and will continue to be something that we know needs a champion in the White House and needs consistent effort applied not only within the White House, but across the federal government and across the nation writ large. Chris has, I think, a favorite saying that has become something that we say very frequently around here, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so it is true that if you're looking to do something that is going to last, that is going to be enduring, and is going to tackle this problem, you got to go with your partners. CISA, National Science Foundation, NIST, DOD, and there are others, OPM, OMB, all have stakes in when we talk about the health and the sustainability of the cyber workforce. And academia, nonprofit sector, and private sector partners all have an even, arguably a greater stake in the health of our economy and the health of our public education system, and what we need to sort of to reduce the cyber talent gap. What this means is as we look to define and to coordinate and to develop a strategy that can tackle a lot of these issues, that means we have to work across each of those lines. Now, for anybody who has worked in the cyberspace, so to speak, for the last few decades, that is not uncommon. The stakeholders are myriad, they're motley, and they're everywhere. and everybody has a role to play. So this isn't uncommon, and it's not a divergence, I think, to think that as we look to define this and define what those gaps are, we have to work together. And that may be deliberate, that may not be as fast as any one of us would like, but it is necessary to do this right and to make sure that it has lasting impact, force, and resources.
Are there any particular processes that you're putting in place now to help facilitate that interagency collaboration?
So we had plenty of discussions, I think, the interagency. I think not to bore the panel or the audience with the the minutia of interagency process. I think we're figuring out exactly what may be the right bureaucratic vehicle for sure. But I will say that, meetings across the interagency and between us and the interagency happen on a frequent basis, various levels of formality. I think ultimately the contours of what that coordination mechanism look like is something we're still deciding, and something we will decide collectively as a group with our partners. We know that a lot of people, a lot of agencies have shown leadership in this space, and we want to be respectful of that. But we do want to make sure that before we move out, everyone's on board with a common plan and a common understanding, and we have consensus before we make a promise or before we say or do anything. Don't want to surprise anyone. We want to make sure that we're all moving together.
Thank you. So Kiersten, let me follow up with you. As the federal government's cybersecurity response agency, how is CISA thinking about leveraging its unique working relationships, especially with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, but also with private industry and critical infrastructure owners and operators to help inform an integrated cybersecurity workforce development strategy?
Well, thanks so much, Terry. And I'll repeat what John said. Thanks very much to NAPA, to Dan, and to Karen, and for all the work that's gone into this important product, this document, and the research and the thoughtful understanding. Obviously, the work that Dan and Karen have done over the years makes them uniquely qualified to weigh in on this and to be so thoughtful, not just in the examination of the problems, but importantly, opportunities for solutions, because they've been a part of a lot of tremendous efforts. And I think, you asked the question about these different stakeholder groups, and in that question actually is part of the answer, which is that none of this can be done by an entity individually. So when we at CISA are looking at workforce development, it has to be in partnership, to repeat what John said, certainly across the interagency, from our perspective as well, with critical infrastructure owners and operators, with our industry partners, with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. As we look at this element, we have these different speculations on the gap in workforce. Cybersecurity, as we all know, is about building solutions and problem solving. So implicit in those two aspects really is an interdisciplinary approach. And so one of the things, as we're looking at building out this workforce, and we're looking at reskilling and upskilling through our cyber defense education and training program, it's very much about helping individuals understand that we need aptitudes in psychology, sociology, history, economics, politics. This is an interdisciplinary problem. And so it's not just about mathematicians and scientists and engineers. And so in doing that, as we're working with our partners across state and local governments and industry, it's making that awareness known so that when we look at our mission in helping address cybersecurity challenges, it's recognizing also how we define the problem. And I think that's one of the key pieces that we have really seen a lot more progress in. As we look at available resources to states, one of the programs that we're particularly engaged in is the Scholarship for Service. It's really a unique program designed to recruit and train this next generation of professionals and security managers to meet the needs of the cybersecurity mission for federal, state, local, and tribal governments. And this program provides scholarships for up to 3 years of support for cybersecurity undergraduates and graduate education. One of the programs that I'm particularly interested in and we're really looking to support is the Cyber Talent Initiative. So in 2016, I served as executive director of President Obama's Commission on Cybersecurity. And one of the 8 issues that President Obama asked us to address was workforce. So obviously, this is something we've all been working on for a long time. And one of the commissioners was Ajay Banga, who was the CEO of MasterCard at the time. And what he put forward following the commission is this effort where an individual graduates from college, becomes part of the program rotates into the federal government, and then interviews for a job in the private sector company, in the case of this example, MasterCard, with some loan forgiveness as part of that. And we're looking to bring those individuals on board. And I mention that because as we look at the workforce, we are in a different phase of employment right now, where it's not just about going into an institution and nestling in there for 20 years. If we are truly going to build out our cyber workforce, it's also about creating the agility across government and industry, state and local governments. The interdependencies of the digital economy really require and mandate that we are open to learning from all of these different aspects. So as we partner with these institutions, it's helping each of them learn from each other. So industry from government, government from industry, different levels of government. One of the other efforts that we're also very involved in is working with underserved communities. We were given a grant that we are now coordinating with the nonprofit Empower and the other nonprofit Girls Who Code to really go into underserved communities to help them understand that there is this workforce called cybersecurity, and it doesn't just mean that you're an engineer, although we're really trying to build out those capabilities as well. And finally, as we look at all of these, working with local colleges and universities, with HBCUs, with other entities, community colleges, vocational schools, to build out and recruit that workforce. I think one of the challenges that we've seen is there are individuals as undergraduates and in community colleges who want to serve, but there's also a big gap. There's oftentimes a big gap between being in an institution and finding that opportunity in government. So we're working directly with some colleges and universities to help minimize that gap and really go to the universities and the community colleges where they are and help them navigate the hiring system for the federal government to provide those opportunities.
Well, that's no easy thing. I know we've been doing a lot of work around making hiring easier, but it sounds like in addition to what John was talking about with interagency collaboration in the partnership space, you've got a lot of exercising of new muscles to be doing and new relationships to be building as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, this workforce development is a priority for Director Easterly. It's something that she has been focused on from the beginning, and really understanding all of the elements and how we can execute that, and the support from our partners in Congress, as well as our partnership with the Office of the National Cyber Director and other agencies, is going to be critical, as well as our relationships with industry and our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. And as you know, we talk oftentimes about a whole of government and a whole of nation approach. And when we look at workforce development, it's absolutely a whole of nation approach.
Absolutely. And that makes a great segue to my next question, which is for Karen, because we've been talking so far about the strategy itself. But once the government-wide strategy is released, what does the panel recommend in terms of operationalizing the strategy?
So first off, I'm excited to be here with the panel, and really to be able to represent the work that the team has done, because it's truly a changing landscape since they've started the report. But I think one of the other things I'd like to circle back just a little bit before I actually answer the question dealing with the strategy is Kiersten hit on a lot of things that CISA is doing, which is to the heart of the issue of why we did the study in the first place. And because there's a great need, and it is going to take partnership with Congress. And this is why Congress has asked for CISA to really take a look at it, because there's a lot of efforts that are underway and have been underway. And I think all of us have talked about it for at least 15 to 20 years in this space. And so what really makes sense, and that gets to the strategy, like what really makes sense given the evolution of where we are now with the new office within the White House, and the expectations associated with what Congress may have on that White House and the executive branch as a whole. So when the strategy gets released, I think a lot of us, especially those of us who have been in the space, is, okay, so how do you actually operationalize the strategy? And then how do you get it so that it's to the point where it's institutionalized and it lives beyond the personalities that are there right now? We're very excited about the leadership that is at the National Cyber Directorate, that is at CISA, that is across the agencies overall in these different key positions, and that how do you bring that strategy together and institutionalize it? John talked about the knit, the inside bureaucracy piece. I think a lot of people would like to really know how that works, but the panel and the team did recommend that a senior official be identified within the office of the National Cyber Director, so that that person is focused on these workforce issues and that it doesn't get lost because of all the other issues that everybody has to deal with as it relates across the nation as a whole, whether it's economics, infrastructure, what's happening, in the world, but that it's important that the workforce issues get addressed, because we can't deal with the overall economic issues and national issues and all these other issues that are important to the nation if we don't have the right workforce with the right skills in place. So that was one of the big recommendations. The other one, which is near and dear to my heart, so I'm so excited that the panel included this, is the measurements and the performance measurements, and really taking a look at that. There are several pieces out there, like CyberSeek is there, but does it make sense to really look at statistics and put a regime around it, similar to the way that the Bureau of Justice Statistics is set up, right? Or the way that the census is set up, and that there's some discipline and quality. We have the Information Quality Act out there. And so that you can rely on this data, and that you're looking at programs and what programs really are closing that gap, so that it helps then Congress and the executive branch inform each other so that they can apply the resources to the right programs in order for us to be able to address the workforce gaps and close them.
Those are really specific recommendations. And so Kiersten and John, I want to turn back to you. And Kiersten first, how do you balance the urgent need for cybersecurity workforce development that Karen and Dan have addressed with the day-to-day urgency of responding in the cybersecurity operations space? Kiersten,
well, thanks so much.
First.
Thanks so much, Terry. And obviously, to your point about Karen's, the specifics, this is what is required now, right? This synchronized national approach to workforce development is critical. And I think, I think sometimes overuse the phrase a unique point in time or an inflection point. However, I do believe that there is a unique opportunity right now, because there is groundswell and momentum around the importance of cybersecurity, both as a national security issue, but also as one, and Dan referenced this a little bit, that is really integrated into everything that we do. I mean, we've all heard the different analogies and metaphors. You don't need to be a car mechanic to drive a car. Most people drive a car every day, but they know, when to put air in the tires, they know to check for oil and those other elements. Cybersecurity is intrinsic to what we do. So to your point about cyber operations and cyber workforce, they're really inextricably linked. And so when we are looking to tackle the key challenges today in cybersecurity, we're also looking at what is the talent that's required to address those issues most effectively. And that goes to the point that I was making about the interdisciplinary nature of this work, of the workforce and of the space. And so one of the other elements that is absolutely a priority for Director Easterly, and one that we're really focused on, is ensuring a diverse workforce. And by diversity, in addition to racial and gender diversity, we're looking at socioeconomic backgrounds, neurodiversity. I'm really proud of the fact that CIS is going to be the second federal agency to work with MITRE on a pilot for bringing in and employing individuals with autism. We're going to be piloting an effort from industry on how to bring in neurodiversity, and not to showcase it as we have individuals with neurodiversity, but to recognize that the integration of thinking differently, of backgrounds, of different types of skill sets is going to be critical. So as we look at what the primary cybersecurity needs are, the operational needs, how to address the threat, how to address the day-to-day, identifying the qualities that are going to be critical in helping us develop solutions in individuals, those traits, those characteristics, and really opening the aperture, because everybody needs to be included in this problem solving, and helping to look at problems differently is obviously going to be, is a priority and is critical.
I love that discussion about diversity. I mean, it plays out in every area that we're thinking about, but particularly here in cybersecurity. So John, actually, let me pull a thread that Kiersten mentioned. You've got urgent cybersecurity workforce needs right now. And yet we're also talking about a K-12 development strategy. How do you pull those things together, and how is ONCD thinking about that?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to have a satisfying answer for you now. I can tell you sort of more broadly, this is something that you would deal with in cyber policy in general. There is a dichotomy between the needs of today. We're dealing with the ecosystem of the last 2 decades. We're dealing with perhaps a lack of prescience, a lack of knowledge. We're dealing with the 2020 hindsight of, wow, we should have done things differently 2 decades ago. And that impels us to have a cyber operational response that can deal with the risks we're having today, the incidents we're having today, the consequences of today. But at the same time, and I know CISA deals with this, and from just a broad strategic perspective, we're dealing with this, is how do you ensure sufficient time and resources into the future of tomorrow? How do you, reshape the cyber ecosystem? And let's be clear, the cyber ecosystem is people, processes, and technology. The first part of that, people, is often forgot about. We need to make sure that we do have a cyber workforce and a cyber pipeline, which includes K-12, starting today, where we can slowly diminish the gap over time. But on the other side, we need to make sure that we're building a more sustainable cyber ecosystem, more defensible technology, more defensible enterprises, more secure technology and supply chains, so that, to a certain degree, we are less reliant in the future on like having to pull together an operational response. There is less risk to manage overall, and the security burden is shifted towards from an engineering perspective and from a design perspective in products and enterprises respectively. I think we have to think cohesively and coherently about this. And, the people piece is often, I think, forgotten about or overlooked. I don't think it's forgotten about, but it is a part of the ecosystem. People use, design, build, and break technology. And that has to be figured into the policy and the strategy moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. And as we're thinking about the people, there's a group of people we haven't really talked about yet, and that is Congress. So John, with ONCD being a new office in the White House, how are you engaging with Congress, and what do you hope they'll do to sustain this focus on workforce development for the cybersecurity space?
That is a great question. So we do have a Leg Affairs capability. We work within our own office and with White House Leg Affairs and with our Leg Affairs offices across the U.S. government. Again, not to get into the minutia of like government policy making when it comes to responding to Congress. We deal with our authorizing committees, and over time we'll deal more and more with committees who either as a primary function or as part of their jurisdiction have a stake in cyber workforce. Let's be very clear. Congress sets the law. Congress establishes the authority and the resources for departments and agencies that can have an impact in this space, and the government writ large, and how it is resourcing its own efforts and how it's pushing resources to the private sector to incentivize them one way or another on cyber workforce. So, Congress is the proverbial elephant in the room when we're talking about cyber workforce. I think for more blue sky ideas that we want to ultimately, that we may or may not want to do, Congress is a key stakeholder. You're going to have to loop them in. I think you have to look at the bills that Congress has written and the views of various members and committees over the last few years to try to get and take that as a key input in any sort of cyber strategy, because Congress, as we've seen over time, is going to make their view and their position known one way or another. Whether it's through oversight or legislation or through the approach process. So they cannot be forgotten, and their views and their willingness to engage on this legislatively or from a public perspective needs to be taken into account as we're crafting strategy, for sure. I think one of the questions you had, which is, who should be assigning roles and responsibilities for this? And sorry for pre-baking your question. I mean, I think, you got to keep in mind departments and agencies are if it's a zoo, there's, they have their, every animal in sort of in the zoo has its cage, is like teeth, its claws. Congress can assign new roles and responsibilities and shift roles and responsibilities between who's who in the zoo. They'll consult the administration, but I mean, they have a very powerful and strong role here that, certainly can't be forgotten about.
Yeah, great point. And Kiersten, how is CISA dealing with its congressional stakeholders on this topic?
Well, I want to first mention something that the report focuses on, which is the ONCD's ability to develop and carry out a national strategy that will depend on close collaboration with leaders and federal agencies and partnerships with industry, academia, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. And so we have been extremely grateful for the partnership with Congress. We actually just hired a new head of legislative affairs this week who comes from the Senate. As we look at all of this, I'll use another quote from Chris Inglis talking about cyber as a team sport. Director Easterly uses it as well. And it's this idea that together we're obviously stronger. And when we look at what we're doing and the resources and support that we've had for different programs to build out the K-12 education, to look at how we're engaging with reskilling in the workforce, the grant program to work with nonprofits that help us reach underserved communities, that continued support and prioritization of the workforce by Congress is critical, certainly to our success. And we are always open and look forward to our continued engagement with Congress as it seeks to really build out this national strategy.
So Kiersten, Congress has given you some additional flexibilities in hiring. The DHS Cyber Workforce program is one. And so you mentioned some of the initiatives earlier around neurodiversity and rotational assignments. What else is DHS and CISA as a subset there thinking about in terms of pilots or improvements to the general government hiring processes?
Well, obviously at CISA, because we're the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, one of the pieces to this is cyber. And there was a program launched in the middle of November called the Cyber Talent Management System, which is really about how do we go and get the best and the brightest and appropriately compensate them, be able to really recruit talent from different areas. This is one of those. But I think a lot of the work, Karen highlighted there, all of these efforts, a lot of the work is looking at how do we work across and integrate our efforts with in partnership with the work that ONCD is going to be doing to build out this national strategy, as well as with other agencies, with industry partners, to identify where there are effective programs and efforts. I talked about the Cyber Talent Initiative, which I think really it's a model for this idea that we've got to create this ability to rotate. We're looking internally at programs where we can attract individuals, again, from undergraduate institutions, from community colleges, have the infrastructure and the support to be able to define a human capital process that can bring individuals in as interns. We're all familiar, those of us who've been in government for a while, with the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. I was a PMF back in the day, and what that does to help bring in talent. And I think the key is really going into the communities, going to where individuals are, and us taking the initiative to go to the talent and not just expect that we can sit in Washington and have the talent come to us. Because again, going to this diversity piece, we have to do the outreach. If diversity is important to us, and again, that is a broad reflection of traits, characteristics, capabilities. If that is a priority, which it absolutely is for the director and for CISA, then we have to go to where they are and be able to assimilate the opportunities to individuals so that we can really shorten that gap. And I think this, as we look at our metrics for success, Karen talked about metrics. It's one of the key elements of success right now that we're looking at CISA. If we look at our metrics for success, it's going to be about going to talent where it is, and also being able to help individuals identify that they have the talent, the aptitudes, the capabilities to really succeed in a cyber workforce.
So Terry, I wanted to jump in on that particular one to expand it out a little bit. That is a great area that John talked about working with Congress, and then how Congress gives certain authorities. And this is definitely inside baseball, but the CTMS system is a pilot system that's underway under a whole different title than the traditional federal government employees. And so it's Title VI, not Title V, which is definitely inside baseball. But to Kiersten's point, the piece of that is getting beyond what John had said, like the 20 years of us thinking, oh, you have to have a 4-year college degree. It has to come from this discipline. It has to be along these lines. And it is attempting to break that mold and get to what Kiersten's talking about looking at capabilities and doing assessments and finding people in non-traditional places to come into these roles to bring that diversity of thought as well. And really looking at their aptitudes. And then the way that the system ends up being designed is based on your aptitude, you can be matched up with a job, and it doesn't necessarily have to be commensurate with your education level. So this then gets into the performance measures that all of us are talking about, which is, again, I'm going to bring near and dear to my heart. In theory, it sounds like that's the way to go, but what the panel and the study team really wanted to emphasize is that you have to have data in order to be able to inform these decisions and these investments going forward. And it's really going to take that analysis of the data in partnership with the private industry, academia, nonprofits, everyone, looking at what are the right tools in order to be able to accomplish what's going to be in the national strategy.
Karen, thanks for adding that in. And panelists, we've got a number of questions in the chat and the Q&A. I can tell there's a lot of interest from our audience in the specifics of workforce development. So I'm gonna diverge a little bit from where we plan to go next and pose these because I think they're really interesting. And the first one, and John, maybe I'll start with you, but anybody feel free to jump in, is what do you tell someone in K-12 about cybersecurity, and where do you try to direct them? Do you try to focus on education pathways? Do you think about security and response? How do you try to tell them what a cybersecurity job looks like?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, not to like pull apart the question a little bit, I think it's going to depend on the age range. If I'm obviously how I talk to them is going to be very different from a 6-year-old versus like my 10-year-old versus a 15 or 16-year-old. First of all, I'd say at a boilerplate language, I think we have to understand that number one, just from a cybersecurity perspective, we need to make sure that our children in K through 12 are understanding the elements of basic cyber hygiene and basic elements of how the systems and the software that they use works. I think one of the risks of I think a number of us any of us are digital natives, right? So I think we've seen the slow, algorithmic stack build over time and how this, and have I think a better sort of visibility in how this technology works and how it can be broken. I'm not speaking for digital natives, but I've noticed, at least from my own children and their friends, that there does seem to be a lot taken for granted in how this works, how it can be broken, and how it can go wrong. So I think from a basic perspective, children need to have an understanding of cyber hygiene and a basic understanding of how it works. The same way we would say, this is how an internal combustion engine works, this is how a car works. We need to be able to get to that point with kids. I think, I got to point out to Kiersten Todt's point on diversity. First of all, every kid who is coming up through K through 12 needs to know that a STEM career field, whether it's computer science, engineering, or cybersecurity, is a possible career field, and it doesn't have to go up to the level of computer engineering and sort of high octane. It can be a more technical fields as well as IT fields and cybersecurity fields. I think kids need to know that those are all viable career paths in what they choose, and all are respectable and frankly lucrative career paths for them to engage in. I think from an education perspective, we need to make sure that all kids know what the art of the possible is, and the art of the possible is high. There is no we shouldn't be fighting with like one arm tied behind our back. We need to make sure that, we're availing ourselves of the full diversity of talent wherever it is. But you have to paint a picture for kids and where they can see themselves in that career field, that it's possible, it's doable, and more importantly, other people have done it and have been successful.
Terry, that question, I think, came from Kostas Torregas, who is one of our distinguished fellow panelists. So thank you, Kostas, for providing your insights throughout the process. And of course, to our other panel members, Danny Weitzner and Mary Lou Goodyear. I would also add that there are foundational programs ongoing today that the government's involved in, that the panel thought was important to build on, work with the K12 sector from the Department of Education, from NIST, from other agencies. So it's not like we have to invent the strategy. It's more that the strategy can integrate these efforts, provide an opportunity to amplify them and to achieve the kinds of outcomes that you described.
Yeah, apologies. I mean, I think we also, from a government perspective, need to make sure that from a public awareness, public education, kids are aware of these government programs, like, and just throwing one out of the hat here, Scholarship for Service, which can propel them not only on a more technical career path, but get their feet wet working in an operational setting, in an enterprise setting with the federal government, and have the merit badge of public service, which I'm sure we all appreciate, and get them set. That's just one of many government programs that you guys mentioned in the report and that we should build on. But it is incumbent upon us to make sure that the K through 12 are aware of those and are eligible for them.
Terry, I just wanted to add onto this because I think it's a very important piece, because we have the short-term goals with workforce, which is what do we have right now? How do we build out the workforce in this moment? But what's also really important is how we create the culture of cybersecurity. And I think we have a unique opportunity right now because all young children in elementary school are using technology. And it should be incumbent upon our educational system that as soon as a child gets an iPad issued to them in school to learn how to read, or a Chromebook, or whatever the device is, to John's point, that the basics of cyber hygiene are educated to them, but that also this culture of cybersecurity is created. When you ask kids what they want to be, first, second, third graders, they talk about the people in their sphere, a doctor, a teacher, a construction worker, the checkout person at the grocery store. It's what they see in their sphere. So if we're able to bring cybersecurity into their sphere at an early age, then we create this culture of cybersecurity, and importantly, this cultural workforce. What we know, and we've known for such a long time, is that children learn languages at a young age because as their brain is developing, they can absorb. I know more about recycling from my children because they were taught it in school. I was not taught recycling in school, but they can tell you all about it, and they recycle now because that's what they were raised with. We have this opportunity with cybersecurity because of how we're using it as an educational tool to have that longer term workforce development, to create that familiarity and that acknowledgement of what this field can be, and the interest to help generate that interest in young children.
Love that idea. And that actually brings me back to one of the final questions that I want to get your take on. Karen mentioned statistics and metrics for success. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, and maybe Kiersten, we'll start with you first. How are you going to know that you're actually making progress on workforce development, and how will you judge if you're having an impact?
It's a great question. And I think, we've always been challenged on metrics in cybersecurity, but you can't measure what you don't know. And so what we're doing, we're actually in the process of building out annual individual performance plans right now, but also as we have the CISA strategy to really put out measurements. How are we going to mark and measure success for CISA in our workforce development? That to me is going to be measured by the outreach that we have to institutions. What are the engagements and the relationships that we have? Which students, which employees are coming from which resources, and how do we look at the complexion of the workforce today, or what we did on January 1st, 2022, and how does it look at the end of the year? Where have we recruited individuals from? What is our retention? One of the things, we have dashboards that we develop on a weekly basis about our workforce that we're constantly looking at to see who are we losing, why are we losing them, who's coming in. We bring in employees every 2 weeks from a pay period perspective. Where are they coming from? How are they brought in? what was the length of the process. Karen talked about some of the hiring practices and how CTMS, I won't do the Title V, Title VI, because probably very few people know it as well as Karen, but the idea of how we're trying to expedite these hiring process through different modes. So then we're going to look at, did we actually expedite the hiring process? Everything from how long does it take to get a drug test done to where are we bringing in these individuals? So we are actually pulling out these metrics for ourselves based on what we see as the workforce that we want to achieve and where we are today and what are the numbers and the data that's going to be so important. And, you know, I can't emphasize this enough. Karen, I know, has been beating this drum for so many years, but really measuring outcome in this space is going to be critical to our success, because we have to see what we're measuring ourselves against and how we can also, what we're going to focus on to improve and where the priorities. And this goes to the congressional question. Once we have data, we can then say, this is where we're having trouble. This may be where we need more support. And this is where we're having successes. And we think the successes are coming from X, Y, and Z. So that analysis is going to be critical to our success.
Great points. And you're talking there about a lot of process measurements in terms of the hiring process, the diversity of the workforce, the outreach. John, let me switch to you. How do you think those inputs and output measurements about diversity and reach in the workforce development programs will reflect in outcome metrics for cybersecurity writ large?
Outcome metrics for cybersecurity are a perilous thing. Again, since we're talking inside baseball, I don't want to get into like proving a counterfactual. It's something we're trying to wrap our mind around, and short of like high octane statistical analysis on something that was prevented and something that didn't happen because we did something. I will say this, I think it's really, really difficult. I mean, I don't have any sort of hard answers for you here. I will commend the work that CISA is doing in getting numbers. Good data, good statistics sets the conditions for good policy. And I think we've seen that, especially in the 20th century, with the rise of statistical agencies informing things such as labor, justice statistics. It sets the conditions by which good policy can be formed. And I think we have to take that awareness, at least from a cyber workforce perspective, and we have to be looking at that as we craft a strategy, is how do we make sure on an ongoing basis that we have good data and statistics by which we're crafting good policy. Diversity measures are obviously a key point of that. Turnover rate is a good point of that. There are a number of things, won't get into like here in detail, of key metrics that we need to be tracking. How does that translate over into cybersecurity outcomes? I think it's a separate but certainly a related question into the broader question the ONCD is going to be trying to attempt to answer, which is how do we set up a routine way to, whether it's strategy, whether it's expectations, priorities, or whatnot, that informs department and agency programs, working with departments and agency programs, department agency spending, and then how do we establish a system by which we can measure and gauge that over time? That is a monumental undertaking. I mean, there are, a ton of performance metrics and performance evaluation programs across the government right now. And there are some on cyber, but pulling that together into a broader strategic plan, I think something that we're looking at more generally, but in workforce in particular this year. Can't say anything now, but there will be more to come this year as our team continues to work with our interagency partners and our stakeholders outside the government.
Thank you. Dan, Karen, any comments on that?
I would add that Kiersten's earlier point about the integral relationship between cybersecurity operations and the skills of the workforce is very important here. And John kind of alluded to that bridge function and how we ask the questions, especially of our Chief Information Security Officer community. How can we learn from private sector companies that have really strong information security programs that get measured in terms of the value they provide to the company? There are lots of different sources that we can do to provide that understanding of it's about having a credential. Yes, it's about measures of input in terms of the composition of the workforce, their skill level, but then connecting that to, all right, we saw that a higher skilled workforce led to a different set of outcomes than another organization where the workforce maybe be less mature in their skill set. Those types of metrics, I think, can be developed over time and be informed by expertise from academia and the private sector and research that they do.
Thanks, Dan. Karen, did you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, and I'm always about the metrics, right? Especially about the outcomes. And so we do get asked, and through this study, you get asked about, well, what about this one specific program, or what about, this particular area, which is really what Congress was asking about, right? Like, there are programs today that are very successful. And you really have to have that longer term view. And I think that's part of what Kiersten was talking about is, okay, do you take some of the programs today and scale them out because they're going to meet that immediate need? And that's part of what the NAPA report really was trying to focus on is, what are some of those short-term objectives to meet the immediate need today so that you could scale those while you're answering some of these midterm and long-term questions that both John and Kiersten brought up. Because in the long run, when you're collecting some of the data, to your point, Terry, to get to outcome oriented, this is going to be proving a negative, right? Like, it's reduction of risk. So how are you going to actually measure that outcome of reduction of risk? It's going to be a series of contributing pieces. But if we today have a whole series of educational programs that are producing, and I'll just pick a field, forensics analysis, and we don't necessarily know how many forensics analysis people do we really need to close that gap? That's the midterm types of things that then through this analysis, through a national strategy, through the partnerships, we can start channeling resources to close the gaps. Like, maybe you need more of these analysis types of capabilities in private industry, in critical infrastructure, and you don't necessarily need them in the federal government. It's a smaller group versus every department and agency trying to build out those same types of capabilities. And it gives the opportunity of the executive branch and then Congress to really shape how do you go forward in the long run so that we can properly resource the executive branch to achieve those outcomes. So there's short-term pieces that are in the strategy, midterm pieces, and long-term pieces, and I think we need to really keep focus on all of that as we go forward, so that both Kiersten and John's group, as the rest of the executive branch, can meet those expectations, because there's a lot of expectations on the executive branch, that's for sure.
Karen, you make a really good point there about short-term, midterm, long-term metrics, but you also talked about metrics not just for the federal government, but this is a national workforce development strategy. So there is one more audience question that I want to bring in here, because I think it is a question not just about federal agencies, but every organization that's playing in this space. And it's about what we currently have as division of labor between the CIO function and the workforce function, which is often in the Chief Human Capital Officer. And those folks oftentimes don't sit in the same meetings. And so how do you think about bringing the CIO piece and the CHICO piece together to really create that integrated approach to workforce strategy and development and cybersecurity? And I'll let anybody who wants to jump in tackle that one.
Well, I'll
Karen?
go first, since I was just the DHS CIO. This is a CXO function. And so when you're looking internally at this, and at DHS, it was really great because we were all in the management function. We're all in the management directorate. And so you could have this question asked, about acquisitions and about security clearance. All of it, right? And so all of us met on a daily basis, and so there was total integration and good partnership. But the way that happens, and I know that's trite, but you really have to really reach out to the other person. Like, the CHICO has to understand really what the needs are of what the CIO is trying to do, and the CIO has to really understand some of the limitations and where the CHICO can partner with them in order to be able to accelerate the hiring process, because that's exactly what we're talking about, right? And so, Angie Bailey just retired out of DHS, but she was and a NAPA fellow, but just like totally a partner, creative, knows what the authorities are to be able to help you really accelerate what that hiring process is. And that has to be replicated across the board, not just within the federal government, but also out in private industry, because those functions are separate in private industry too. So they have to be aligned across the board so that you can achieve this outcome for the nation.
So Karen, I think your work with Angie on the talent management system is an example of a real achievement that can come when you led a team that kind of put together that initiative that was then launched recently this year. So I think that's a good example of a practical outcome. And I would also note that in the 21st century, managing talent requires analytics and requires sort of the use of technology to drive that forward, to understand what are the skill sets you need to do the types of analysis that can come from strong use of information resources that a CIO is expert in. So that partnership is essential to a 21st century organization, whether it's in government or industry.
Well, and I want to make sure that CISA gets due acknowledgement on CTMS, because there's an internal working group within DHS, and it is co-chaired by CISA, because that system would not be successful if the needs of the skill sets that we were looking for in CIO and that CISA was looking for to be able to deal with their roles and responsibilities. So CISA co-chaired that. And so, the success is also CISA's to share.
Let's wait till we hire the people on it, and then that's to your point about success, then we can talk about the success. I just want to make a quick point, Terry, about this point, because I think what you shared, it's a really critical piece. I think that we've got to start looking at how cyber is integrated into position descriptions, and that engages the human capital office, particularly when thinking about the private sector, that this has to be something that everybody is bringing in. We talked about culture, and cyber is a part of the culture. And if we're looking at cyber hygiene practices and the responsibility and the accountability that every employee has to do the basics on phishing and authentication, that has to be integrated into position descriptions, into performance reviews, into all of those elements. When I was executive director of the commission that I referenced in 2016, my billet was an IT specialist for commerce. I can guarantee you that I am not an IT specialist, but that was the only label that was existing for anything that had to do with cyber. That was only 5 years ago. So as we look at position descriptions, it's being really thoughtful about how we are articulating cyber responsibilities, the cyber role in these. And that, I think, marries up some of the work of human capital with the CIO and with other elements.
Thanks, Kiersten. We could be here for another hour if we tackled all of the audience questions. We don't have time for that. And so as we wrap up, John and Kiersten, I want to give each of you a chance for some closing comments. So John, let me go to you first.
Thanks, Terry. So, we talked about a lot today, and I really do want to thank NAPA for a number of the recommendations in your report, a number of the recommendations calling on the National Cyber Director to show leadership in this space and to move the ball forward. I will tell you this, that call has been heard by us and by Director Inglis. It is an issue that we expect to lead on, and frankly, Director Inglis feels accountable for in moving this ball forward. We won't do it alone. We'll do it with our interagency partners. We'll do it with private sector. We'll do it with academia and the nonprofits, and to the extent practical, Congress as well. And we do want to, define and help build a strategic plan, a strategy for how we can tackle some of these issues. We've got a few other things underway. It's too early to speak about now, but I can guarantee you will hear more from the National Cyber Director's Office on this issue in the months to come. It is a key priority for us, and as we build, it's a priority for our own hiring to make sure that we get the right talent in our office to make sure that we can push this ball forward. As I said earlier, cyber workforce is an ecosystem issue. If we ever hope to shift the dynamic and shift the security burden, more centrally to where it can be handled, and to make sure that we have a more sustainable and secure ecosystem. A top priority has got to be making sure that our people, our folks and people we hire are ready and able to meet the challenge, not only in their numbers, but also in the skills that they bring to the table. We know this, and we know that this is a do or die situation over the next 10 years as technology is infusing itself into ever more intricate areas of our lives. Transportation, energy, in the devices that we use every day. So the stakes get ever more higher, even as the need for human capital and talent in the space continues, that gap continues to increase. So it is a top priority for us. And thanks again for this event, and look forward to working with you guys in the future.
Thanks, John. Kiersten, your closing thoughts?
Well, thanks so much, Terry. And Dan and Karen, thanks so much for your leadership on this study, and to the experts that you all engaged, and for engaging CISA in this piece. And again, always for your continued leadership. We're fortunate that experts like you have stayed in the space so that we have this knowledge and this history to truly understand where we've come from, but importantly, where we should go. And as I mentioned earlier, and I can't emphasize this enough, workforce is a priority for Director Easterly, for CISA. We've talked about it a lot. It's out there. I talked about the dashboards and the metrics on a weekly basis. That wasn't something that just has been happening. That was something that was driven by Director Easterly's leadership to really understand how are we doing in workforce and what do we need to do. I'll just close with the concept as we look at what we've been doing, that there are really three elements here that we've got to focus on. It's building out this K-12 education, the curriculum, as well as how we're educating individuals and kids at young ages about cybersecurity, so that we're inherently building this culture, this workforce that will be beneficial in the long term. There's the piece about how do we bring in a cyber workforce into the federal government to ensure that we're attracting talent, that we're recruiting talent, that we're retaining this important talent. And that's something certainly that CIS has been very involved in. We talked about CTMS and how we are looking at that. And again, I'll just emphasize the work that we are focused on as going to where the talent is, going into underserved communities, community colleges, vocational schools, looking at non-traditional educational journeys. So we're ensuring that we're really bringing in diversity of thought, as well as other traits and characteristics. And then finally, this national workforce strategy that the report calls out. And this is needed. We need to synchronize efforts, multiple lines of efforts, because there will be a force multiplier effect when we unify that. And I'm grateful to be working with the Office of the National Cyber Director, with John and his team, to be able to support this effort, because there are these efforts, but together they will be much stronger. So certainly as we at CISA sit here and understand the importance of workforce, it's a priority, and look forward to continuing to work with you and hopefully sharing the data and the metrics that demonstrate success. In addition to, I'm sure, the challenges that we'll learn along the way, but as we all know, we learn as much from our challenges and our failures as we do from our successes, and we'll continue to incorporate that into our learning. So thank you so much for the opportunity to engage in this discussion and to really start this journey, this segment of the journey, with all of you.
Well, John and Kiersten, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And I especially want to thank you, Dan and Karen, for your work in guiding this important study through to conclusion. We are looking forward to seeing the impacts of the recommendations on the nation's cybersecurity workforce in the future. And thanks to all of you who joined us today in the audience. You can find the Academy's report on our website at napawash.org. Thanks for joining.